Coogs house. Everyone's feeling the momentum. Everyone's feeling good. Everyone's rolling straight down the lane. It's time to go bowling. No, seriously.
You are Locked On Coogs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Coogs, podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who can't step by, thank you for making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. I appreciate you making us your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Cougs. If you want to join the conversation but don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below what your highest score in bowling has ever been. You remember, you might not want to admit it, but you remember. Tell us in the comments down below. Got a fun show for you today. We're doing a little bit of hypothesizing. Looking at the schedule, the rest of the way is Houston is halfway through the season and entering a bye week. What will it take for the Houston Cougars to go bowling this year? That means entering into bowl season. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. More on that fun later. But I want to take a second to break down kind of the odds of this thing happening, right? And looking at like what riding this momentum would be for Houston to get to that big deal bowl game. Now, no one expected Fritz to be at a bowl game in his first year, and frankly, at 2-4, there's still it's a pretty outside shot, right? We're not like sitting here talking about Houston as if they ought to be in a bowl or anything quite like that. But I do think there's an outside shot. And I think there's a series of shock the world kind of games. Talk about the end that if Houston gets those, man, like they really ought to. There's a couple of like games Houston has a real shot in that I wouldn't call crazy shock the world kind of upsets necessarily, right? And then there's honestly, I know it sounds presumptuous to say this after winning a game last Friday, but a couple of games that Houston kind of has to win. They got to have those. And those get Houston to 4 games on their own. The first game that they've got to have is Kansas coming out of the bye week. Now, Kansas has been spiraling. Kansas has had a bad year. Some people's dark horse pick to win the conference has yet to, as the recording of this podcast, has not beaten an FBS opponent this year. After opening with FCS Lindenwood, they lost to Illinois. They lost to UNLV at home. That sounds familiar. They lost at West Virginia. They lost to TCU, and they lost to Arizona State. That's bad. Now, I know that Houston also lost to UNLV, and quarterback change Friday night chaos helped beat TCU, and last year's West Virginia win was on a Hail Mary and all that kind of yada yada, right? However, I feel fairly confident that if you gave Houston the same schedule as Kansas, they'd be better than 1-5 right now. I feel very confident in that Houston and Willie Fritz are a very well-coached team that is trending in the right direction, and I feel very confident that something feels like it's off in Kansas. The other part of this game for Houston and what kind of makes another must-win or gotta-have-it kind of game is that Kansas is not playing their games in Lawrence this year. The University of Kansas is in Lawrence, Kansas. They're playing their home games. I guess the rest of their home games are at Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City. Yes, those are about an hour and a half apart. That's not close. It's about to be basketball season. Fans are fairly disinterested in a bad football team up there. They're not making the trip. Where did that home field advantage go? Right, suddenly things are shaking out in a way where Houston should have some advantages. This should feel more like a neutral site game than a Kansas home game, right? Because of the crowd and those kinds of things. This should also, for what it's worth, be it should be an opponent that is better than some of the people that have already beaten Kansas this year, right? Houston did beat TCU, right? Those kind of things. TCU beat Kansas pretty handedly. The one thing I will say that Kansas has had in their couple wins over Houston in recent memory is, last year or 2 years ago, Jalen Daniels, right? I guess that was 2 years ago. Pretty electric runner, true dual threat quarterback. He's having a pretty ironically, given how poorly the season has gone for them as a team, he's had a decent year running the football. He's got 3 rushing touchdowns. He's getting over 3 yards a carry. Um, and he's having kind of a mediocre, maybe a little less than mediocre year passing the ball, has 1,000 yards, 7 touchdowns. The big deal for Jalen Daniels is he can't keep the ball in Kansas's hands. He's fumbled a couple times, there's 8 interceptions, and I feel like Houston's defense is going to do the same kind of thing. We're going to break that game down a lot more between now and then, but I think that's a gotta-have it kind of game. Same thing with Baylor. Now, this year, Houston has to go to Baylor, just over into Central Texas for the second to last game of the year. Just kidding. I said that backwards. I got my schedule here wrong. Baylor comes to Houston. I'm reciting what happened last year when Houston went to Baylor and won at their place. Baylor comes to Houston. So it's a home game against a bad team. Baylor, similarly, this year has beaten Tarleton State. They beat Air Force. They've lost to Utah. They've lost to Colorado. They've lost to BYU. They've lost to Iowa State. And I know you're like, Parker, those are good teams. They played really badly for large stretches of those games. It does not feel like Baylor has played a full 60 minutes of football at any point this season. And I don't know that that's going to get better between now and late November. No choking, pun intended, there with the cough. I will say the other part of this is that Dave Aranda is probably on the hot. He's definitely on the hot seat. He's probably on the hottest seat in the Big 12. What's to say he's still their head coach come November 23rd, as opposed to some interim thrown out there and trotted out there for the masses? I know it's the NFL, but we just saw the New York Jets fire their coach. They're a week behind as far as the week counts go, and their seasons are longer, right? What's Baylor going to do? Well, even if they haven't necessarily fired him officially yet, will he know the writing is on the wall by November 23rd? Will that program know the writing is on the wall? Will they have guys get out and say, I'm trying to transfer, get me out of this thing, et cetera, but then who knows? They're also, for its worth, Baylor, giving up a lot of yards on the ground per game, 161 rushing yards per game the Baylor Bears are giving up. We've seen when Houston plays well, that's the thing that they do well. I think Houston should win that one easily. Home game for Houston, last home game of the year for Houston, which under the last regime had some weirdness to it. I think now we're in good hands. And I think that that'll honestly be a good thing for Houston. On the whole, that's 2 games, right, that Houston needs to win that get them up to 4 wins. 6 wins makes you bowl eligible. I guess technically at 5, if there were not enough bowl teams, you could have an outside shot. But 6 wins gets you bowl eligible. So we're really only halfway there. Before we get all the way there, I want to talk to you about our buddies over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now NFL fans can hit the season with a big return. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you can place your bet. You can start with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. You can place your first $5 bet at FanDuel.com. I think Houston's favored in the bye week this week. That's at FanDuel.com. Welcome back. Sorry about that. Locked on Coogs, Park Rangers here, talking about ways that Houston can get to a bowl game. Now, I mentioned in the last segment there were some games Houston had to have. In this segment, there are a couple of games that Houston's got a real shot at. Houston, probably isn't going to be favored in either of these games, but there's a pair of games here that, it would not take a whole lot of craziness or chaos for Houston to have a real shot at winning. The first of which is Arizona. Arizona is a hard team to figure out in the Big 12 this year. They got smacked by Kansas State. They beat Utah. They have a weirdly competitive game against Northern Arizona. They lose to Texas Tech. Arizona's a weird program this year. I will say I'm impressed by a couple of their playmakers. Noah Fafita, the quarterback, is really, really good. Tatoria McMillan, the receiver, is really, really good. But as a unit, as a whole team, I don't know that they're the kind of team that I feel like Houston can't beat. I don't think it'd be a crazy world for Houston to beat this Arizona team, a lot like Houston beat last year's West Virginia team, a team that I think most people had on paper because of a handful of playmakers is a lot better than Houston. And Houston came out and I know they won in a Hail Mary, but that was after having just given up a Hail Mary kind of pass. Houston really should have won that game before that by a few plays. And Arizona feels like the same kind of matchup to me. Last year, you all said I was crazy for thinking Houston should beat West Virginia, and then they did, right? Arizona is 3-2, and Arizona was ranked in the preseason to start the year. I don't mean to say that they're not like a talented team or program. I just wonder if they maybe aren't who we thought they were. The other thing about Houston playing Arizona on their schedule is that Houston is Arizona's lone home game between trips to UCF and TCU. And I know UCF has had a couple stinkers in a row. I weirdly think, though, that going to the bounce house is the kind of thing that can kind of rattle a program a little bit. I also wonder if there'll be some sort of you go all the way across the country and then you come back to the West Coast, or Arizona's, I guess, almost the West Coast at that point, and kind of have some sort of a travel letdown sort of a week. I think all that is a way to add up to Houston ultimately having a good night. There's also another Friday night game. It's a late Friday night game. I think is that 10:15 local time? That might be Eastern time. That's still crazy late. But this is a West Coast game for all intents and purposes in terms of TV dollars on a Friday night. Pac-12 After Dark has turned into Big 12 After Dark, to say the least. All that is to say, we've seen Houston as a program play very well on these weird nights, right? Take out that Tulane game from a couple years ago, but last year's West Virginia, just TCU just last week. These are the kind of things that could work in Houston's favor, right? So I think that's a good thing as well. The other game that kind of fits into this category with a certain caveat is Houston will be playing BYU relatively soon, should we say, October 26th, which is just a couple weeks away. The big deal there, listen to me, is that Cam Rising's health seems to be an ever-evolving question. No one can tell what the deal is with Cam Rising. He's the 26-year old quarterback or whatever at Utah. He's had some pretty strong years there. Won the Pac-12 a couple times, whatever, right? When Cam Rising's there, Utah is really good. What's been interesting is his backup, Isaac Wilson, is certainly not. To date, Isaac Wilson has 6 passing touchdowns and 7 interceptions. That's a pretty bad ratio. He's throwing 55.7% completions. Again, I think a thing that works in Houston's favor. And he's not Cam Rising is not the only guy hurt or the only guy going through health things. And frankly, Houston could cite several of their own problems with health. I don't mean to say that's an excuse, but in terms of matchups, if Houston gets to see Arizona at the end of the season and then Utah later this month without Cam Rising, that's another game where, like, okay, it's not that weird for Houston to come out and win that one. And honestly, I'm not going to sit here and say I expect it, or whatever, but I would feel pretty good about it. I wouldn't feel worried about playing Utah without Cam Rising. You get to play him at home. it is a Saturday. Like I think that'd be a pretty big deal. And then frankly, they'd be ranked unless something crazy happens between now and then. Utah will play Arizona State and TCU. I really I think that's a game that unless Cam Rising and even Cam Rising out there and they're not unbeatable or anything, but if he's not there, I kind of like they almost should win. Is that daring to say? And then suddenly that's two, that's four more games. That's bowl season. You're at 6 wins in bowling, and that'd be so big for this program. Um, because honestly, we've talked about it before in the final months of the last guy, but going to a bowl is not just getting to play in the game, get the swag and whatever for a program. It's also another month of practice, of organized practice for those young guys. It really does kind of launch you into the next year, into the offseason and the next year in terms of your development. And I think for a team with as many young guys as this team has, right, between Zion and Boogie and Pancake, and on the defensive side, you got a handful of DBs, Halsey coming back, all those kinds of guys, right? You're really looking at like a chance in the bowl game to let those guys practice together for another month before going into the off season. And so suddenly, if you can beat Kansas and Baylor like you should beat Arizona and potentially also Utah like you can, then suddenly you're right back in that conversation as tough as that start was. Now, there are two more games on the schedule that are admittedly a little bit more challenging, but I don't think that they're impossible. And if Houston could manage to win one of those games, they could maybe drop a game that Cam Rising played or have a head scratcher that we don't anticipate coming or something like that. Before we get into what those two games are that Houston could pull the upset in, I want to talk to you about our buddies over at FanDuel. Sorry, I want to talk to you about our buddies over at Game Time. Game Time. Let's say that one more time. I want to talk to you about our buddies over at Game Time. Best place to get last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Now, I will say it's bad that I messed that up because this is a sponsor that I enjoy using. When you're looking for tickets to concert, theater, sports games, whatever's going on in the area, you can find seats to any venue, any type of event, and you can see what it looks like in that section and row for that event, for that venue. So you see exactly like what the sight lines are and those kind of things. If you can find the same section and row cheaper somewhere else, they'll credit you back 110% of the difference to know you're getting the lowest price guaranteed. You can take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account code, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Again, terms apply, create account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Locked on Coogs, Parker Ainsworth here, talking about the schedule as we're halfway through with the Houston Cougars and what the Cougs can do to potentially get into bowl season here. Been dealing with the same lingering respiratory stuff, so excuse the coughs as they come and go. But we haven't gotten to a couple games on the schedule yet, and they're probably against the two best teams left on the schedule. And they're frankly, two teams that I don't think anyone would pick Houston in a Vegas-y type of way to beat, but I also don't think they're unbeatable. The first, which is Kansas State. Now, Kansas State does have a loss to BYU. Without that loss, Kansas State's actually a very good football team, and I say actually because that loss is pretty bad. But outside of that loss to BYU, their next closest game is a 10-point win at Tulane, right? They obliterated the Tennessee Martin their non-FBS opponent. They went to Arizona, beat the crud out of them. They beat the brakes off Oklahoma State. I think that this team's going to do pretty well against Colorado this weekend. Their quarterback, Avery Johnson's a true dual threat kind of guy. Long flowing locks. He has 61% completions, 9 touchdowns. He also adds 320 yards on the ground, getting over 7 yards a pop with his legs. Kid's really good. Their offense as a whole scores a lot of points, gets a lot of yards. But when I see them, I also see a team that BYU played a really disciplined football, did not beat themselves, and kind of ran away with when the two teams played. Now BYU is big up front, but they were really able to in that game to kind of take the will away from Kansas State in a weird late night kind of game. Had like the most embarrassing, or I guess for Kansas State's the most embarrassing, for BYU it's probably the most awesome punt return of all time. It was, I guess, technically a 90-yard punt return, but he ran more like 140 yards by the time he switched fields a couple times. At that point, the game's already out of hand. In that game, BYU managed to only run the ball for 92 yards. So people think like, oh, well, that's not really what Houston's going to do. They're going to try and run the ball more. But they only passed the ball for 149 yards. They really only less than 250 yards of offense, right? This wasn't like an offensive explosion to get to 38 points. A lot of field goals, take the points where they're there, play solid, let Kansas State make their own mistakes, which, they had three turnovers Kansas State did in that game. Houston's defense can force teams into turnovers as well. Feels fairly similar. Again, it's not out of the question. Kansas State's really good, but if you look at the one loss, it's not something that Houston can't do. Now, Houston's final opponent, both of the season and of this episode, is BYU. For my money, if you want, take it if you want. There's jokes on you. I think BYU looks like one of the best teams in the conference. And so Houston ending with them, I think earlier this year, before the season started even, I might have said something like, oh, that's a good team to end on. Good, strong program, but no one you can't compete with, whatever. I think BYU looks like the best team in the conference right now. The quarterback, Jake Retzloff, really, really good. Really, really good. 1,200 yards, 12 touchdowns, just 5 interceptions. He has another 150 yards on the ground. He's really, really good quarterback. And, I don't know if he's going to be a pro or not. He's not Shedeur Sanders, kind of like pro scouting level kind of guy or whatever, but very good college quarterback. And I guess technically they have Gary Bohannon on the team, which is kind of a funny Big 12 tidbit. But across the board, Houston has to bring their A game to beat BYU at BYU team this season. The challenge of the game is that it's the final home game for BYU. They'll know exactly what's on the line. They'll know exactly what they're playing for. I think BYU rightfully thinks they'll have a shot at playing in Arlington for the Big 12 championship after that. And they're certainly not going to want to let Houston play spoiler. Houston can. I think Houston spoils someone's season this year. But they're not going to there's no trap game coming. Unless maybe they're running away with the Big 12. They're first. They won't fall further than second. They don't play Red Sox. Something weird happens. It's a weird conference, right? I could see that being that kind of a thing. I could also see it being kind of thing where BYU is running away with the conference, so excited to be in the Big 12 title game that they're looking past it. I could see that, I guess. Coach Satake is not quite that kind of a guy, I don't think. But I could see that. The big deal is playing in Provo the Saturday after Thanksgiving is going to be really hard to do. It's built for the way Houston wants to play. Run the football, control the clock, play good defense. It's cold there, man. It is cold there. It's going to be a rough outing. But I don't think that's the only way. I don't think beating either one of those teams, Kansas State or BYU, are requirements for being bowl eligible. So that's a plus. I also think that whether it's Utah, Cam Rising shows up from wherever, that Houston's going to beat one of these teams that people are not projecting them to. I know that I think the Locked On people are telling me that TCU was that person already, and I think there's more to it than that. If you think there's not, I think there's less to it than that. If you think I'm wrong, tell me in the comments down below or find me on X to talk about it at Painsworth512. I'm going to talk about that, the Big 12, the Houston Cougars, anything each and every day. We got more this week. Cross my fingers on some big basketball news. Still trying to figure out what exactly is going on with. There was a Dellinger article about a potential Super League, and then there's stuff in the House settlement going through and so on. So as I'm reading through that, more on that will come out as well. Got a lot more I'm reading, more on that next week will make a lot more sense. And let me tell you one thing. You do not want to miss Big 12 squad this week. Locked On Coogs is the primary Locked On podcast network. That means your team every day. Go Cougs.